Every parent's worst nightmare is leaving their child behind, and every child's deepest fear is being forgotten by those they love most. In the Arizona Territory of 1887, 6-year-old Bonnie has been living this nightmare for 3 long years. She sits on the steps of an abandoned trading post, holding a faded photograph of her parents who promised to return, but never did. The people of Cedar Wash have given up hope, but Bonnie still watches the horizon each day. One evening, a giant, Apache warrior named Aidam finds her crying in the dust. He lost his own daughter years ago, and something about this lonely child touches his heart. Against the town's fears and whispers, he takes her in. As years pass, they become an unlikely family. But when secrets about Bonnie's parents finally come to light, both must face painful truths. Can love truly conquer the wounds of the past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered planks of the Cedar Wash trading post as Bonnie clutched the faded photograph against her chest. 3 years had passed since that terrible day when her parents, James and Mary Fletcher, had kissed her goodbye and promised to return before the first snow. She could still hear her mother's voice, sweet as honey and warm as summer rain, whispering those final words, "Be brave for Mama, little desert flower. We'll be back before you know it." But the snows had come and gone 3 times now, and the trading post that once bustled with travelers and merchants stood empty as a tomb. The wooden sign that read, "Fletcher's Fine Goods," hung crooked on rusted chains, creaking mournfully in the desert wind. Tumbleweeds gathered in the corners of the covered porch where Bonnie had made her home, sleeping on a pile of horse blankets and surviving on whatever scraps of food she could find or trade for with her mother's remaining jewelry. The town of Cedar Wash lay a mile down the dusty road, a collection of sun-bleached buildings that seemed to shrink smaller each year as folks moved on to more prosperous places. It was the kind of settlement that existed purely out of stubbornness, perched on the edge of Apache territory, like a dare to the desert itself. The general store, run by a kind-hearted man named Owen Walsh, served as the unofficial town hall, where folks gathered to share news and gossip. Next door stood the saloon, perpetually half-empty, and across the street, a small church that saw more use as a storm shelter than a house of worship. Bonnie knew every face in Cedar Wash, though most of them looked at her now with a mixture of pity and discomfort that made her stomach twist. There was Mrs. Dorothy Crane, the blacksmith's widow, who had tried numerous times to convince Bonnie to come live with her in town. Her offers always came with the same conditions: stop waiting for parents who were clearly never coming back, accept that they were probably dead, and try to move on with her life like a sensible child should. Sheriff Dan Cooper, a stern man with graying temples and eyes like winter frost, had made it clear that he considered Bonnie's situation an ongoing problem. Every few months, he would ride out to the trading post with official-looking papers, threatening to place her in an orphanage in Tucson if she didn't accept proper guardianship from one of the townspeople. But Bonnie had learned to be as elusive as smoke when she saw his dust cloud approaching, disappearing into the maze of canyons and arroyos that surrounded her home, until he gave up and rode away, muttering about stubborn children and impossible situations. The desert had become her teacher in ways that no schoolhouse ever could. She knew which cacti bore sweet fruit and which springs ran clean, even in the driest months. She could read the sky like a book, predicting storms hours before they arrived, and had learned to move through the landscape as quietly as the lizards that sunned themselves on the red rocks. Her skin had turned brown as leather from the constant sun, and her once golden hair had darkened to the color of mesquite honey. But it was the loneliness that marked her most deeply. At 9 years old, Bonnie carried herself with the careful dignity of someone much older, speaking little and watching everything. She had conversations with her parents' photograph, telling them about her day and asking their silent faces when they planned to come home. Sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, when the coyotes sang their mournful songs, she would allow herself to cry, but never during the day. Daylight was for watching the horizon and keeping hope alive. On this particular evening, as the sun began its descent behind the jagged mountains that bordered their valley, Bonnie sat on her usual spot on the trading post steps. The photograph rested in her lap, its corners worn soft from handling, the faces of her parents already beginning to fade, despite her desperate efforts to preserve them in her memory. She was trying to remember the exact shade of her mother's eyes when a shadow fell across the porch. Looking up, Bonnie found herself staring at the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the setting sun, and arms corded with the kind of muscle that came from a lifetime of hard living. His skin was the deep bronze of the Apache people, weathered by wind, and sun into something that looked carved from the very rocks of the canyon. Long black hair, streaked with silver, hung in 2 braids that reached nearly to his waist, and his dark eyes held a depth of sadness that seemed to mirror her own. This was Aidam, though Bonnie didn't know his name yet. What she did know, from the whispered conversations she'd overheard in town, was that he was a figure of legend and fear among the settlers. Stories followed him like shadows, tales of his prowess as a warrior, his skill with both rifle and tomahawk, and his reputation for appearing and disappearing like morning mist. Some said he had once been a great leader among his people, while others claimed he was a lone wolf, cast out for reasons no white person understood. But as he stood there in the gathering dusk, what struck Bonnie most was not his intimidating presence, but the gentleness in his eyes as he looked down at her. There was something familiar about that look, a recognition of pain that ran too deep for words. Around his neck hung a small leather pouch, worn smooth by countless hands, and, though she couldn't see what it contained, she sensed it held something precious and lost. "Child," he said, his voice deep as thunder rolling across distant mountains, "why do you weep?" Bonnie realized that tears were indeed sliding down her cheeks, though she hadn't been aware of crying. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, trying to summon the fierce independence that had kept her alive for 3 years. "I'm not weeping," she said, though her voice betrayed her with its trembling. "I'm waiting." Aidam's eyes moved to the photograph in her lap, and something shifted in his expression. Without invitation, he lowered himself to sit on the porch, steps beside her, moving with surprising grace for such a large man. The wooden planks creaked under his weight, but he settled as quietly as a cat. "Waiting is hard work," he said after a long moment. "Harder than hunting or fighting or any labor a person might do. I know about waiting." Despite her wariness of strangers, something about his presence calmed the constant anxiety that lived in Bonnie's chest. Maybe it was the way he didn't rush to fill the silence with meaningless words, or how he seemed content to simply exist in the same space without demanding anything from her. "My parents went to handle some business," she said, surprising herself by speaking. "They promised to come back before the first snow. That was 3 winters ago." Aidam nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. From his medicine pouch he withdrew something small, a tiny moccasin decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and yellows that caught the last rays of sunlight. It was child-sized, made for feet no bigger than Bonnie's own. "My daughter wore these," he said simply. "She walked onto the spirit world when the fever came. That was 7 winters ago." The weight of shared loss settled between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Bonnie looked at the little moccasin, then at Aidam's face, and saw her own grief reflected in his dark eyes. "Do you still wait for her?" she asked. "Every day," he answered honestly. "But I have learned that sometimes the spirits send us what we need, in forms we do not expect." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Aidam rose to his feet, but before he left, he reached into his pouch once more and withdrew a piece of dried meat wrapped in clean cloth. "A person cannot wait properly on an empty stomach," he said, placing the food beside her on the step. "I will return tomorrow if you would like company while you wait." Bonnie watched him disappear into the night as silently as he had arrived, and for the first time in 3 years, the trading post didn't feel quite so empty. She unwrapped the meat and found it seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize, but that tasted of earth and sky and something indefinably comforting. That night, as she settled into her blankets on the porch, Bonnie found herself looking forward to tomorrow in a way she hadn't since her parents left. The photograph remained pressed against her heart, but the crushing weight of solitude had lifted just enough to let her breathe. 3 months had passed since Aidam first appeared at the trading post, and his daily visits had become as regular as sunrise. Each morning he would arrive with food, stories, or simply his quiet presence, teaching Bonnie small skills that made her life easier: how to weave grass into waterproof baskets, which plants could heal cuts and burns, and how to read the flight patterns of birds to predict weather changes. On this particular morning, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Bonnie was cleaning the interior of the trading post when her fingers discovered something unusual. Behind a loose board in the wall, near what had once been her father's office, she felt the edge of something metallic. Working carefully, she pried the board away and gasped at what tumbled into her palm. It was a locket, tarnished with age, but unmistakably made of real silver. The delicate chain had tangled around itself, and the oval pendant bore an intricate engraving of a desert rose in full bloom. But it was the inscription inside that made Bonnie's hands tremble as she read it aloud in the dusty silence. "Forever. Faithful RM to my desert rose, April 15th, 1869. The date was 18 years old, from before Bonnie was even born. But more puzzling still was the initial RM. Her father's name was James Fletcher, not something beginning with R. And yet the locket had been hidden in his trading post, concealed deliberately behind a board that showed signs of being removed and replaced multiple times. Bonnie sank too, the floor, turning the locket over in her hands as questions crashed through her mind like floodwater through a desert wash. Who was RM? Why had her father hidden this locket? And what did Desert Rose mean? Was it simply the flower engraved on the pendant, or something more personal? She was so absorbed in her discovery that she didn't hear the approaching horses, until they were almost at the trading post. Quickly, she slipped the locket around her neck and tucked it beneath her shirt, just as Sheriff Cooper's voice boomed across the porch. "Bonnie Fletcher, come out here right now, child. We need to have a serious conversation." Stepping outside, Bonnie found not just the sheriff, but half the town council with him: Owen Walsh from the general store, Mrs. Crane, and 2 other men she recognized but didn't know well. Their faces wore expressions of grim determination that made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. But it was the sight of Aidam, standing calmly beside his horse at the edge of the group, that truly alarmed her. His hands were bound behind his back with rope, though he showed no signs of struggle or distress. His dark eyes met hers across the dusty yard, and she saw something there she had never witnessed before, not fear, but a deep, weary resignation. "Sheriff Cooper," Bonnie said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "what's happening here?" "What's happening," Cooper replied, dismounting and striding toward her with official papers in his hand, "is that this situation has gone on long enough. It's unnatural and dangerous for a white child to be under the influence of a savage, and the territorial authorities have finally given me the legal backing to do something about it." Mrs. Crane stepped forward, her face creased with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Bonnie, dear, you must understand that we're only thinking of your welfare. You can't live like this forever, wild as a coyote pup. You need proper schooling, proper Christian guidance, and a proper home." "I have a home," Bonnie replied, gesturing toward the trading post. "This is my home, and my parents will come back for me." Owen Walsh, usually the kindest man in Cedar. Wash shook his head sadly. "Child, Your parents have been gone for 3 years. If they were coming back, they would have done so by now. It's time to accept the truth and let folks who care about you help you build a new life." But it was Sheriff Cooper who delivered the blow that changed everything. "The fact is, Bonnie, that this Apache has been filling your head with heathen ideas and keeping you from accepting help from decent Christian folks. The law says I have the authority to remove you from this unhealthy situation and place you in proper care, whether you like it or not." For the first time since his capture, Aidam spoke. His voice carried clearly across the yard, dignified and unafraid despite the circumstances. "The child chooses her own path," he said. "She has survived 3 winters through courage and wisdom. Beyond her years, she does not need to be taken from the only home she has known by men who would cage her spirit in the name of their own comfort." Cooper's face reddened at being contradicted by what he clearly considered a prisoner. "You don't get a say in this, Apache. You've already done enough damage, filling this child's head with your savage ways. She belongs with her own kind, not learning heathen customs from a murderous redskin." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, and Bonnie felt something ignite in her chest. Not fear, but fury. These men who had watched her survive alone for 3 years without lifting a finger to truly help, now presumed to decide her fate because they couldn't tolerate the sight of her finding comfort with someone they deemed unacceptable. "Aidam is not savage," she said, her voice rising with each word. "He's the only person who bothered to sit with me when I was scared. He taught me how to find food and water, how to read the sky for storms, and how to be strong when everything feels hopeless. He never asked me to stop waiting for my parents or told me they were dead. He just helped me survive while I waited." Mrs. Crane's expression softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "Bonnie, honey, I know you're grateful to him, but gratitude isn't the same as what's right. You need to be with people who can give you a proper Christian upbringing and prepare you for civilized life." "Civilized?" Bonnie's voice cracked with emotion. "Which part is civilized? Letting a child fend for herself for 3 years, or tying up the only person who showed her kindness?" Sheriff Cooper had heard enough. He motioned to the other men, who began moving toward Bonnie with obvious intent to physically restrain her if necessary. But Aidam's voice stopped them cold. Though his hands were bound, his presence seemed to fill the entire space as he stepped forward. "I invoke the right of sanctuary under Apache law," he said formally. "This child has placed herself under my protection, and I have accepted the responsibility. By the treaties signed between our peoples, you cannot remove her without just cause. Proven before both Apache and white authorities." Cooper laughed harshly. "Your Apache laws don't mean spit in American territory, savage. And I've got all the authority I need right here in these papers. What happened next would be talked about in Cedar Wash for years to come." Bonnie, small as she was, stepped deliberately to stand beside Aidam, placing herself between him and the armed men. "Then you'll have to take us both," she said, her chin raised in defiance that reminded everyone present of her father's stubborn streak. "Because I won't go with you willingly, and I won't let you hurt him for trying to help me." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Finally, Owen Walsh cleared his throat and spoke the words that sealed their fate. "Sheriff, maybe we should think about this more carefully. The child clearly doesn't want to leave, and forcing her might do more harm than good. Perhaps there's another way to handle this situation." But Cooper was beyond reason now, his authority challenged by a child and an Apache in front of half the town. "There's only one way to handle this," he snarled, drawing his pistol. "The Apache comes with me to jail, and the child comes to town. End of discussion." It was then that Aidam did something that surprised everyone, including Bonnie. With his hand still bound, he smiled, not with humor, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just seen his opponents reveal their true nature. "Then we choose the path of the desert wind," he said calmly to Bonnie. "Are you ready to run, little sister?" Before anyone could react, Aidam had somehow freed his hands from the loosely tied ropes and scooped Bonnie up with one arm. With movements that seemed impossible for such a large man, he vaulted onto his horse's back and spurred the animal into a gallop, disappearing into the maze of canyons before the shocked men could even think to pursue them. As the dust settled, Mrs. Crane looked at the spot where they had vanished and shook her head slowly. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "I don't suppose we handled that as well as we might have." 6 months had passed since their dramatic escape from Cedar Wash, and Bonnie had never felt more alive. Their camp in Hidden Canyon, a secret place known only to Aidam and a few trusted Apache friends, had become a sanctuary where time moved differently than in the outside world. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires around them, red rock carved by countless centuries of wind and water into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if the desert itself had decided to create art. Bonnie's days now followed rhythms, far older than the artificial schedules of town life. She woke with the sun, helped Aidam tend their small fire, and shared breakfast while listening to the morning songs of canyon wrens echoing off the rock walls. The loneliness that had been her constant companion for 3 years had gradually faded, replaced by a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her parents left. Aidam had proven to be a patient and gentle teacher, though his methods were unlike anything she had experienced before. He taught through stories and observation rather than lectures, allowing her to discover truths about the desert through her own experiences, guided by his wisdom. "The desert speaks to those who learn its language," he told her one morning as they climbed to a high ledge overlooking their canyon. "Today you will learn to hear what it says about water." He showed her how to read the landscape like a book, written in stone and shadow. The deeper green of certain plants revealed underground springs, while the flight patterns of birds in the early morning pointed toward reliable water sources. She learned to taste the air for the metallic hint that preceded rain, and to watch for the subtle color changes in distant rock faces that indicated approaching storms. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to move through the desert as if she belonged there. Her feet, once tender from wearing shoes, grew tough as leather and sure as a mountain goat's. She could scramble up cliff faces that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, and navigate by stars with an accuracy that amazed even Aidam. The Apache language came to her with surprising ease, as if her mind had been waiting for these particular sounds and concepts. Aidam spoke to her in both English and Apache throughout each day, and gradually she found herself thinking in the more precise, metaphorical language of his people. Simple concepts like east became where the sun is born, and directions were given in relation to sacred mountains and the movements of celestial bodies rather than arbitrary compass points. But it was the arrival of Running Bear that truly marked Bonnie's transition from visitor to family member in Aidam's world. The elderly Apache appeared at their camp one evening, like smoke materializing into human form, his weathered face creased with decades of desert wisdom and his eyes sharp as obsidian chips. Running Bear spoke no English, which forced Bonnie to navigate their conversations entirely in Apache. At first, this was intimidating. The old man's expressions seemed to range from stern disapproval to barely tolerant amusement. But gradually, she realized that his apparent severity was simply the way he tested her commitment to learning his people's ways. "The girl moves like a white person trying to walk on eggs," he told Aidam during one of their evening conversations, apparently assuming Bonnie couldn't understand. "But her heart is beginning to learn desert songs. Perhaps there is hope for her." This grudging approval felt more valuable than any praise she had ever received from teachers in her brief experience with formal schooling. Running Bear began including her in the small rituals and ceremonies that marked important moments in their daily life. The blessing of their morning meal, the evening prayers of gratitude to the 4 directions, and the careful tending of their fire that connected them to all the generations of their people who had warmed themselves by similar flames. It was Running Bear who taught her to work with the traditional beadwork patterns that would eventually become her specialty. Using a kit that had once belonged to Aidam's daughter Lily, He showed her how to create the intricate geometric designs that told stories without words. Each color had meaning. Blue for the sky and water, red for the life force that flowed. Through all living things, yellow for the sun's blessing, and white for the purity of snow on sacred mountains. Bonnie's fingers, nimble from years of foraging and survival tasks, proved naturally suited to the delicate work. Within weeks, she was creating patterns that Running Bear declared not completely embarrassing for a beginner, which she had learned was high praise indeed from the taciturn elder. But it was during a quiet evening around their campfire that the most significant change occurred. Aidam was telling one of his stories, this one about Coyote, the trickster figure who appeared in many Apache tales. When Bonnie found herself laughing at Coyote's latest mishap, the sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed with genuine joy rather than nervous politeness. "Coyote reminds me of," she began in English, then caught herself and switched to Apache. "Coyote is like the foolish men in town who think they know the desert better than those who were born here." Aidam's eyes crinkled with amusement, but it was his next words that changed everything between them. "My daughter Lily used to say such things. She saw the foolishness of people who claimed wisdom they had not earned." The comparison to his lost daughter was clearly intended as a compliment, but it also highlighted the growing complexity of Bonnie's emotions. She loved Aidam with a fierce devotion that surprised her in its intensity, but she carried guilt about the depth of that love. Did caring for him mean she was betraying her birth parents? Was it wrong to feel more secure and happy with this Apache warrior than she had felt in her last months with James and Mary Fletcher? That night, as she settled into her sleeping robes beneath a canopy of stars more brilliant than any she had seen from the trading post, Bonnie found herself speaking to the darkness. "I still remember you," she whispered to her parents' distant spirits. "I still wait for you to come back, but I'm not just waiting anymore, I'm learning to live." It felt like a confession and a promise rolled into one. She would always be James and Mary Fletcher's daughter, but she was becoming something more as well. A bridge between worlds, a child of two families, a young woman learning to carry multiple identities without losing herself in the complexity. The next morning, as she helped Aidam prepare breakfast, she used the word "father" when asking him about their plans for the day. It slipped out naturally, without thought or hesitation, and though they both noticed it, neither commented on the moment. Some changes were too profound for words. They could only be acknowledged in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, where love grows without permission and families form in ways that have nothing to do with blood. 2 full years had transformed Bonnie from a desperate, waiting child into a young woman of 11 who moved through the desert with the confidence of someone born to its ways. Her Apache had become fluent enough that Running Bear occasionally forgot she hadn't been raised among their people, and her beadwork now rivaled that of women twice her age. The intricate patterns flowed from her fingers as naturally as breathing, each design telling stories of sky and earth, wind and water, and the sacred connections between all living things. But it was on a crisp morning in early spring that their peaceful existence faced its first serious threat since leaving Cedar Wash. Aidam had gone to hunt in the high country, leaving Bonnie with Running Bear to practice a particularly complex beading pattern that depicted the emergence of the Apache people into this world. She was lost in the meditative rhythm of the work when Running Bear suddenly stiffened, his weathered hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Riders coming," he said in Apache, his voice carrying the tension of a man who had survived. By recognizing danger before others even sensed it. "Government men," from the sound of their horses. Through gaps in the canyon walls, they could see dust clouds rising from the desert floor, multiple riders moving with the purposeful formation of an official party. Running Bear quickly began gathering their most important possessions while motioning for Bonnie to pack her beadwork kit. "They've found us?" she asked, though the question was mostly rhetorical. After 2 years of peace, she had almost allowed herself to believe they were truly safe in their canyon sanctuary. "Government sends agents to ask about Apache children being raised by whites, or white children being raised by Apache," Running Bear explained grimly. "Either way brings trouble for everyone." As they prepared to relocate deeper into the canyon system, Bonnie found herself wrestling with emotions she hadn't expected. Part of her felt the familiar anxiety of pursuit and potential separation from Aidam, but another part, a part that surprised her, felt a flash of anger at being hunted like a criminal for the simple act of finding a family that loved her. When Aidam returned that afternoon to find their camp abandoned, he followed the subtle trail signs Running Bear had left and found them in a hidden alcove 3 miles deeper in the canyon. His face was grim as he listened to Running Bear's report about the government agents. "Mrs. Crane sent word through her nephew who works at the territorial office," he explained after Bonnie pressed him for details. "She warned us that federal agents have been asking questions about illegal adoption and Apache-white relations. They're looking specifically for us." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Mrs. Crane, who had once supported taking Bonnie away from Aidam, was now warning them about government interference in their family. "What do they want with us?" Bonnie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Control," Running Bear said simply. "White government wants all Apache on reservations, all white children in white schools. They don't understand families that cross the lines they've drawn on their maps." That night, as they sat around a carefully concealed fire, Aidam shared news that further complicated their situation. During his hunting trip, he had encountered other Apache who brought word from the reservation system. Stories of families separated, children sent to boarding schools hundreds of miles from their homes, and traditional ways being systematically destroyed in the name of civilization and progress. "They would take you to a school where speaking Apache is forbidden," he told Bonnie, "where you would be punished for practicing the beadwork Running Bear taught you, or for honoring the 4 directions in your morning prayers." Bonnie's hands stilled on the beadwork in her lap, a piece she had been creating to honor Lily's memory, incorporating symbols that Aidam had described from his daughter's favorite childhood stories. The thought of being forced to abandon not just her family, but the cultural knowledge she had worked so hard to learn filled her with a determination she hadn't known she possessed. "Then we don't let them take me," she said with quiet finality. But even as she spoke the words, Bonnie was grappling with internal conflicts that cut deeper than fear of government agents. Her birth parents' photograph, now worn nearly transparent, from years of handling, still held a place of honor among her possessions. She had never stopped hoping they might someday return, but that hope had evolved from desperate need into something more complex. A treasured memory of love that had shaped her, but no longer defined her daily existence. Sometimes, in the quiet, moments before sleep, she found herself wondering what James and Mary Fletcher would think of the young woman their daughter had become. Would they approve of her Apache family? Would they understand that learning Aidam's ways hadn't erased her love for them, but had instead given her the strength to carry that love without being crushed by their absence? Running Bear, with the intuitive wisdom of someone who had watched many young people navigate difficult transitions, seemed to sense her internal struggle. One evening, as they worked together on a complex beading pattern, he addressed the question she hadn't been able to voice. "A person can have many families," he said, without looking up from his work. "The family that gives you life, the family that teaches you to survive, the family that helps you become who you are meant to be. None of these families makes the others less important." His words carried the weight of personal experience. She had learned that Running Bear himself had been raised by an aunt after his parents died in a cavalry attack, and had later adopted several children orphaned by similar tragedies. But what if the families would not understand each other? She asked, switching to English as she sometimes did when discussing concepts that felt too complex for her still developing Apache vocabulary. Running Bear set down his beadwork and looked at her directly, his dark eyes holding depths of understanding. "Earned through decades of loss and recovery, then you become the bridge between them," he said simply. "You carry the best of each family in your heart, and you honor all of them by living a life worthy of their love." That night, Bonnie took out her parents' photograph and studied it by firelight for a long time. She could still see her mother's gentle smile and her father's protective stance, but they no longer seemed to be looking at her with disappointment or abandonment. Instead, she imagined she could see approval in their faces, pride in the strong, skilled young woman their little girl had become. She carefully wrapped the photograph in a piece of soft deerskin and placed it next to her beadwork kit. Two treasures that represented different aspects of her identity, but no longer seemed to be in conflict with each other. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, possibly including another confrontation with forces that wanted to tear apart the family she had found. But tonight, for the first time in years, Bonnie fell asleep without the weight of guilt or confusion about where her heart belonged. She was James and Mary Fletcher's daughter, Aidam's adopted child, and Running Bear's student. She was all of these things simultaneously, and that was exactly as it should be. The restlessness had been building in Bonnie's chest for weeks, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Despite the contentment she had found in their canyon sanctuary, despite the deep bond she shared with Aidam, and the wisdom she gained daily from Running Bear, something gnawed at her during the quiet moments before sleep. The locket she had discovered months ago, with its mysterious inscription, "RM to my desert rose," had raised questions that seemed to multiply in the darkness, questions that made her feel as though she was living only half a life while the other half remained hidden in shadows. Running Bear, with the intuitive understanding that came from decades of watching people wrestle with unfinished business, was the first to acknowledge what they all felt, but hadn't spoken. A person cannot walk forward properly when part of their spirit is still looking behind, he said one evening as they sat around their small fire. He spoke in Apache, but his meaning was clear to everyone present. The girl needs to understand what happened to her first parents, or she will always be waiting for ghosts. Aidam had been quietly sharpening his knife, but at Running Bear's words, his hands stilled on the whetstone. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of difficult truths that couldn't be avoided forever. "It could be dangerous," Aidam said finally, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when discussing serious matters. "The trading post draws attention. Government men still ask questions about us. Going back there is necessary." Bonnie interrupted, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I need to know what really happened to them. Not knowing is like carrying a stone in my chest that gets heavier every day." The next morning, Aidam made the decision that would change everything. "We'll go to the trading post one more time," he said, "but we go prepared. And we go carefully. If your father was the cautious man I believe he was, there may be answers hidden where only his daughter would think to look." They traveled under cover of pre-dawn darkness, moving through terrain that had become as familiar to Bonnie as the lines on her own palm. The desert was painted in shades of grey and silver by the half-moon, and she found herself remembering the first time Aidam had taken her into these canyons. How lost and frightened she had felt, how the landscape had seemed hostile and alien. Now the same rocks and arroyos felt like old friends, offering protection and guidance to those who understood their language. The trading post stood exactly as she remembered from her last visit, but somehow it looked smaller than her memories suggested. Weather and neglect had aged the building considerably. Several roof boards had warped and separated, letting moonlight stream through in dusty shafts, and tumbleweeds had gathered against the walls, like visitors who had come to stay. "Your father built well," Aidam observed, running his hands along the doorframe and testing the integrity of the walls. "This structure could stand for another 20 years if properly maintained. He chose his materials carefully, placed everything with purpose." Inside, the familiar smells of dust and old leather brought a flood of memories that made Bonnie's throat tighten with emotion. But she forced herself to focus on their mission rather than the ghosts that seemed to whisper from every corner of the building. "If I were hiding something important," she said, thinking aloud as she examined the main room, "where would I put it? Somewhere safe from casual thieves, but somewhere I could access it quickly if needed." They searched systematically, examining every board, every stone, every possible hiding place they could imagine. It was Aidam who noticed the anomaly. Several floorboards in her father's small office area that looked identical to the others, but felt different under pressure. "These boards move slightly when you step on them," he said, kneeling to examine them more closely. "And look here, the nail heads are brighter than the others, as if they've been removed and replaced recently." Working together with careful precision, they pried up the suspicious boards to reveal a hiding place that took Bonnie's breath away. Lined with oiled canvas and carefully sealed against moisture, the cavity contained treasures that her father had obviously considered worth protecting at any cost. The leather-bound journal was the largest item, its cover worn smooth by handling, and its pages filled with her father's neat, precise handwriting. But there were other documents as well. Official papers bearing territorial seals, hand-drawn maps, and what appeared to be copies of legal deeds and mining claims. Bonnie's hands trembled as she opened the journal to its first entry, dated March 15th, 1884, just 2 months before her parents had left on their fatal journey. "Vincent Hale came to the trading post today with 2 of his men," her father had written. "He claims that I owe him money for the original purchase of this land, but I have all the legal documents proving I bought it fair and square from the territorial office. He's threatening to take the property through the courts if I don't sign over the mineral rights voluntarily. I told him I'd consider his offer, but I don't trust him. There's something in his eyes that reminds me of a rattlesnake coiled to strike." Page after page revealed a story that made Bonnie's understanding of her parents' departure crumble like sun-baked adobe. This hadn't been a simple business trip. It had been a desperate attempt to expose a criminal conspiracy that threatened not just their family, but countless others throughout the territory. March 22nd, talked to Miguel Santos today. He's the Mexican prospector who found silver on the Morrison place. Says Vincent Hale's men came to his camp 3 days ago, claiming Tom Morrison owed them money and had signed over his mining rights as payment. But Miguel saw the whole thing. They forced Morrison at gunpoint to sign papers, then shot him when he tried to run. They told Miguel to keep quiet or he'd meet the same fate. The entries continued through April, each one painting a darker picture of systematic land theft and murder. Her father had been gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, documenting a pattern of crimes that reached from small mining claims all the way up to major territorial land grants. April 3rd. More victims coming forward now that word is spreading. I'm willing to listen. The Weatherby family lost their ranch last month. Hale claimed their father owed gambling debts, but Mrs. Weatherby swears her husband never touched cards or dice. The Clarks had to abandon their homestead after Hale's men burned their barn and threatened their children. I'm starting to understand the scope of what we're facing here, but it was an entry from late April that revealed the true danger her parents had been facing. April 18th. Found out today that Sheriff Cooper is taking money from Hale. Can't trust any local law enforcement. Miguel Santos disappeared 3 days ago. His camp was burned. No trace of him anywhere. I think they killed him for talking to me. Mary and I have decided we have to take this evidence to federal authorities in Santa Fe. It's the only way to stop Hale before he kills more innocent people. The final entry, dated just days before their departure, was written in handwriting that looked shaky with emotion. April 25th. We leave tomorrow for Santa Fe. I've hidden copies of all the evidence here at the trading post. If something happens to Mary and me on this journey, I pray that someday Bonnie will find these papers and understand why we had to leave her. We're not abandoning her. We're trying to save her and dozens of other families from a man who kills anyone who stands. In his way. God willing, we'll be back before winter. If not, may she forgive us and know that everything we did was out of love. Aidam read over her shoulder, his face growing grimmer with each page. When they reached the end, both sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they had discovered. Your parents were warriors, Aidam said finally, his voice carrying deep respect. They fought evil with the only weapons they had, truth and courage. Bonnie wiped tears from her cheeks, but these weren't tears of abandonment or self-pity. They were tears of pride, of understanding, and of a different kind of grief. Grief for parents who had died as heroes rather than lived as cowards. They never came back because they couldn't, she whispered. Hale killed them. Yes, Aidam confirmed gently, but their evidence lives on. This journal could destroy Hale's entire operation if it reaches the right people. As if summoned by the conversation about danger, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the desert air. Multiple riders moving fast and with purpose, their destination clearly the trading post, where Bonnie and Aidam had just made their momentous discovery. Time to go, Aidam said, quickly gathering the journal and documents. But as they prepared to slip away into the familiar maze of canyons that had sheltered them so often, Bonnie realized that finding the truth had only marked the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous journey. 3 days after their narrow escape from the trading post, a stranger arrived at their canyon camp, carrying news that would change everything Bonnie thought she knew about her parents' fate. The man appeared at sunset, emerging from the desert, shadows, with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going, despite the seeming impossibility of finding their hidden sanctuary. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the lean build and weathered skin of someone who spent his life on horseback under the desert sun. His clothes were dusty but well made, and he carried himself with a quiet authority that reminded Bonnie of her father. Most remarkably, he seemed completely unafraid of walking into an Apache camp, greeting Running Bear in fluent Apache before. Switching to English when he saw Bonnie, "My name is Ramon Gutierrez," he said, settling cross-legged by their fire as if he had been invited. "I've been looking for James Fletcher's daughter for 3 years. Aidam's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but something in the stranger's manner, respectful, patient, tinged with sadness rather than threat, made him pause. "I was your father's friend," Ramon continued, addressing Bonnie directly. "We worked together sometimes, trading information about men like Vincent Hale, who prey on honest folks trying to make a living in the territories." Bonnie felt her breath. "Catch, you knew my parents?" "I knew them well," Ramon said sadly, "and I know what happened to them." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of long-awaited answers and dreaded truths. Finally, Aidam spoke the question that Bonnie couldn't force past the tightness in her throat. "Tell us." Ramon reached into his saddlebags and withdrew. A compass, silver-cased and engraved with initials that made Bonnie's heart stop. JF in elegant script, exactly like her father's careful handwriting in the journal they had discovered. "Your parents never reached Santa Fe," he said gently. "Hale's men caught up with them 2 days out from the trading post. They were camped by Willow Creek, probably thinking they were safe because they had made good time and hadn't seen any pursuit." The compass felt warm in Bonnie's palm, as if it still held something of her father's essence. She turned it over and found a second inscription on the back: "To my beloved Mary, may this always guide you home." "James gave Mary the compass when they got married," Ramon explained. "He said it was so she would always be able to find her way back to him, no matter how far apart they might be." Running Bear, who had been listening intently despite his limited English, asked a question in Apache that Ramon answered in the same language. Their conversation was brief but intense, and when it ended, both men looked grim. "What did he ask?" Bonnie demanded. "He wanted to know if your parents died fighting or if they were murdered in cold blood," Aidam translated quietly. "Ramon says they fought bravely, but they were outnumbered 5-1. The words hit Bonnie like a physical blow, but strangely, they also brought a kind of relief. For years, she had imagined her parents abandoning her, getting lost, or simply deciding not to return. The truth, that they had died trying to protect her and stop a criminal, was devastating, but somehow easier to bear than the alternatives her mind had created. "There's more," Ramon said, his expression growing even more serious. "Hale didn't just kill them to silence them. He's been systematically eliminating everyone who could testify against his land-grabbing scheme. Your parents were witnesses to a murder. They saw Hale's men kill a prospector named Miguel Santos, who had discovered silver on land Hale wanted to claim. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrible clarity. Her father's journal had mentioned gathering evidence of Hale's other illegal activities, but she hadn't understood the full scope of what they were facing. "How many people has he killed?" she asked. "We know of at least 7 deaths that can be directly linked to him," Ramon replied. "Probably more that we can't prove. He operates like a spider at the center of a web. He rarely does the killing himself, but his men follow his orders without question." Aidam had been studying Ramon's face throughout the conversation, and now he asked the question that cut to the heart of their situation. "Why are you telling us this now? What has changed?" Ramon's smile was grim. "What's changed is that Hale has finally made a mistake. He's gotten greedy and careless, and there are federal investigators starting to ask questions about his mining operations. If we can get James Fletcher's evidence to the right people, along with testimony from his daughter about what she knows, we might finally be able to stop him. But that would mean—" Bonnie began. "It would mean putting yourself in danger," Ramon acknowledged. "Hale knows that James had evidence against him, and he's been looking for it ever since. When he learns that you're alive and old enough to understand what your father discovered, you'll become a target." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Bonnie found herself thinking about the compass in her hands. Her father had given it to her mother as a symbol of their love and commitment to finding their way back to each other. But now it seemed to carry a different message, a call to finish what they had started, even if it meant walking into danger. "If I testify against Hale," she said slowly, "would that help put him in prison?" "It might," Ramon said honestly. "Your father's journal and the legal documents you found would be powerful evidence, but Hale has money and influence. Even with everything we have, there's no guarantee a court would convict him." Running Bear spoke up in Apache, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Aidam translated for Ramon and Bonnie. "He says that sometimes justice comes from the courts, and sometimes it comes from other places. But either way, it must come, or evil men like Hale will continue to hurt innocent people." Bonnie stood up, still holding the compass, and walked to the edge of their firelight, where she could see the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Vincent Hale was probably sitting in comfort, confident that he had gotten away with murder and theft. Her parents' bodies lay in unmarked graves, their dreams of building a life in the territory buried with them. But their evidence lived on, hidden for 3 years, and now ready to speak truth to power. And their daughter, trained by an Apache warrior, strengthened by desert hardships, and guided by the wisdom of elders who had survived their own encounters with injustice, was no longer the helpless child who had waited on trading post steps. When she turned back to face the 3 men around the fire, her decision was clear in her eyes. "Tell me what we need to do," she said. The hidden cave where her parents' remains rested had been carved by centuries of flash floods into a natural cathedral, its walls smooth as polished marble, and its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to reach toward eternity. Ramon had led them. Here, following landmarks described in cryptic notes, he had found among Miguel Santos's belongings, the prospector who had witnessed Hale's crimes and paid for that knowledge with his life. Bonnie approached the 2 weathered blankets with a mixture of grief and reverence, her hands trembling as she recognized the pattern her mother had favored for their bedding at home. Beside the remains, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, were the possessions James and Mary Fletcher had carried on their final journey. And hidden within those possessions was evidence that would redefine everything Bonnie thought she understood. about her identity and her future. The legal documents were more extensive than anything they had found at the trading post. Deeds, surveys, mining claims, and territorial grants painted a picture of systematic fraud that reached far beyond simple land grabbing. But it was a leather portfolio marked with official territorial seals that contained the revelation that stopped Bonnie's heart. "Certificate of birth," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "Bonita Rosa Martinez, born April 15th, 1876, to Roberto Martinez and Maria Elena Santos Martinez." The paper shook in her hands as the implications crashed through her mind like a flash flood through a narrow canyon. The locket's inscription, "RM to my desert rose," suddenly made perfect sense. Roberto Martinez had been her birth father, not James Fletcher. "I don't understand," she said, looking between the birth certificate and the men who watched her. With varying degrees of sympathy and concern, Ramon cleared his throat gently. "James and Mary Fletcher adopted you when you were 6 months old. Your birth parents, my brother Roberto and his wife Maria, died in a cholera outbreak that swept through the mining camps that winter." The compass in her other hand felt different. Now, not a symbol of her parents' love, but a gift from people who had taken in an orphaned infant and raised her as their own daughter. The realization was overwhelming. But strangely, it didn't diminish her love for James and Mary. If anything, it made their sacrifice more precious. They had died protecting a child who wasn't even their blood, because love had made her theirs, in every way that mattered. But Ramon wasn't finished with his revelations. "There's something else, Bonnie, something that changes our entire situation." He withdrew another document from the portfolio, this one bearing multiple official seals and signatures. "Your birth father, Roberto, held legal claim to mineral rights covering nearly 3,000 acres of territory, including the land where Hale's largest mining operation is currently located." Aidam's sharp intake of breath told her he immediately understood what this meant. But Bonnie needed him to say it aloud before she could fully grasp the magnitude of the discovery. "As Roberto Martinez's heir," Aidam said slowly, "you don't just own the rights to a single mining claim. You own the rights to most of the land Hale has been illegally mining for the past 5 years. The weight of inherited wealth should have been exciting, but all Bonnie felt was a cold dread settling in her stomach. That makes me valuable to him, doesn't it? Not just as a witness he needs to silence, but as someone he needs to control." "Exactly," Ramon confirmed grimly. "If Hale could somehow gain legal guardianship over you, he could continue his mining operations legitimately. All he would need is a friendly judge and some trumped-up charges against your current guardian." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon outside the cave. But this time, there was no opportunity for escape. They had ventured too deep into the cave system to reach an alternate exit. Before being discovered, Sheriff Cooper's voice boomed through the stone passages with official authority. "Bonnie Fletcher, I have legal papers here requiring your immediate surrender into territorial custody. Your Apache friend is wanted for kidnapping and interference with legal guardianship proceedings." Ramon cursed under his breath. "Hale works faster than I expected. He must have had those papers prepared weeks ago, just waiting for word of your location." But it was what they heard next that revealed the true scope of Hale's plan. A second voice, smoother and more cultured than Cooper's frontier drawl, carried clearly through the cave entrance. "Sheriff, please remember that Miss Fletcher is not a criminal. She's a confused child who has been manipulated by savages and desperados. Our goal is to rescue her and provide proper Christian guardianship until she comes of age." Vincent Hale had come personally to oversee her capture, which told Bonnie everything she needed to know about how desperately he wanted control over her mineral rights. "He doesn't want to kill me," she realized aloud. "He wants to own me." Aidam's jaw tightened with controlled fury. "Which is worse than death for a free spirit." Running Bear, who had been examining the cave walls while the others talked, suddenly motioned for silence. In Apache, he whispered something that made Aidam's eyes widen with hope. "What did he say?" Bonnie asked. "He says this cave connects to the underground river system. There is a way out, but it requires swimming through flooded passages in complete darkness." Aidam's expression was grim. "It is dangerous even for experienced cave swimmers." Sheriff Cooper's voice grew impatient. "You have 10 minutes to come out voluntarily. After that, we're coming in to get you, and I can't guarantee anyone's safety if we have to do it the hard way." Bonnie looked at the legal documents scattered around her parents' remains, evidence of murder, fraud, and theft that could bring justice to multiple victims. Then she looked at the birth certificate that had revealed her true heritage and made her an heiress to a fortune built on her birth father's mining claims. Finally, she looked at Aidam, the man who had found her crying in the dust and taught her that family was about choice and love rather than blood. His dark eyes held steady confidence in her ability to make the right decision, whatever that might be. "If we try to escape through the flooded passages, we might all drown," she said. "Yes," Aidam agreed. "If we surrender, Hale will control my inheritance and probably have you killed for interfering with his plans. Also, yes. And if we fight, some of us will probably die, but at least we die free." Aidam smiled, the first genuinely happy expression she had seen from him since this crisis began. "Now you think like an Apache warrior." Bonnie carefully wrapped the legal documents in the oiled cloth that had protected them for 3 years and secured the bundle to her belt. The compass and her birth certificate went into the medicine pouch Running Bear had made for her, next to the faded photograph of James and Mary Fletcher that had sustained her through her years of waiting. She was Benita Martinez, heir to mining. Claims worth a fortune. She was Bonnie Fletcher, daughter of people who had died fighting injustice, and she was Aidam's adopted child, raised in the wisdom of the desert and trained in the warrior's path of protecting what mattered most. 10 minutes is enough time to make Hale regret coming after us personally," she said, checking the loads in the rifle Aidam had taught her to use. "Let's show him what happens when you threaten an Apache family." The sound of men entering the cave mouth reached them clearly now, boots scraping on stone, voices calling for surrender, the metallic click of weapons being readied. But deeper in the cave system, 3 people prepared to make their stand, knowing that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Outside, Vincent Hale waited confidently for the surrender of a helpless child he planned to control and exploit. He had no idea that the little girl who once waited on trading post steps had grown into something far more dangerous than he could imagine, a young woman with nothing left to lose and everything she loved to protect. The underground river that Running Bear had discovered flowed through passages carved by millennia of patient water, creating a network of tunnels that honeycombed the entire canyon system. Swimming through them in darkness, with only the faint current to guide their direction, tested every survival skill Aidam had taught Bonnie over the past 4 years. But it was the weight of the legal documents she carried, evidence that could topple Hale's entire criminal empire, that gave her the strength to push through flooded passages that seemed to stretch on forever. When they finally surfaced in a hidden grotto nearly 2 miles from where Hale's men waited, all 3 were exhausted, but alive. More importantly, they had emerged with their evidence intact and their freedom preserved. But Ramon's grim expression as he studied the canyon. Walls told Bonnie that their escape was only the beginning of a much larger confrontation. "Hale didn't bring just Sheriff Cooper and a few deputies," he said, pointing to dust clouds visible in multiple directions across the desert floor. "There are riders positioned at every major exit from this canyon system. He's not just trying to capture you. He's trying to ensure that no one who knows his secrets ever leaves this place alive." The realization that they were facing what amounted to a siege changed the nature of their situation entirely. This wasn't about a simple arrest anymore. It was about Hale eliminating the last threats to his criminal enterprise, even if it meant committing mass murder in the process. but it was Running Bear who pointed out the strategic advantage their enemies had inadvertently given them. "When a snake coils to strike, it cannot flee," he observed in Apache. "Hale has committed his forces to this canyon. If we can turn the trap around on him, he has nowhere to run." Aidam translated for Ramon, then added his own tactical assessment. "We know this terrain better than his men do. We know every hidden path, every water source, every position that offers cover or high ground. If we're going to make a stand, this is actually the best possible place to do it." What followed was a planning session unlike anything Bonnie had ever experienced. The three men, Apache warrior, Mexican vaquero, and desert elder, combined their different fighting traditions into a comprehensive strategy that would have impressed any military commander. They identified choke points where superior numbers could be neutralized, cached supplies at strategic locations throughout the canyon, and established fallback positions that would allow them to retreat deeper into the cave system, if necessary. But it was Aidam who raised the question that cut to the heart of their moral dilemma. "We can fight Hale's men and probably survive, but that won't solve the larger problem. Even if we escape, he'll keep hunting Bonnie as long as she represents a threat to his operations. The only way to truly end this is to destroy his power completely, which means we need to get that evidence to federal authorities," Ramon added, "and we need Bonnie alive to testify about what she knows." The impossible nature of their situation was becoming clear. They needed to fight their way out of the canyon, travel hundreds of miles to reach honest lawmen, and then return to testify in legal proceedings, all while being hunted by a man with virtually unlimited resources and no scruples about murder. It was then that Running Bear suggested the solution that would define everything that followed. Speaking in Apache, his words carrying the weight of tribal wisdom passed down through generations of warfare and survival, he outlined a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. "Instead of running from Hale," Aidam translated, "we bring the authorities to him. We make enough noise in this canyon that federal investigators will have to come see what's happening." "How do we make that kind of noise?" Bonnie asked. Running Bear's smile was predatory. "We turn his siege against him. We make him commit so many crimes in such a public way that even corrupt territorial officials can't ignore what he's doing." The plan they developed over the next several hours was complex in its details, but elegant in its conception. They would use their knowledge of the canyon to conduct a series of hit-and-run attacks on Hale's forces, not to kill or escape, but to provoke him into increasingly desperate and visible actions. Each attack would be designed to force him to reveal more of his criminal network, bringing in additional men and resources until the situation became too large to hide or cover up. Meanwhile, Ramon would use his contacts in the territorial government to ensure that reports of the disturbance reached federal authorities. The evidence Bonnie carried would be cached in multiple secure locations, so that losing any single copy wouldn't doom their case. But the most crucial element of the plan was also the most dangerous. Bonnie would have to reveal herself to Hale's forces at carefully chosen moments, reminding him that she was still free and still in possession of evidence that could destroy him. Each appearance would escalate his desperation and force him into more reckless actions, but it would also put her at tremendous risk. "You don't have to do this," Aidam told her as they prepared to put their plan into motion. "Ramon and I could handle the fighting while Running Bear keeps you safe in the deep caves." "No," Bonnie said firmly. "This started with my parents trying to stop Hale from hurting innocent people. I'm going to finish what they started." From his medicine pouch, Aidam withdrew the sacred eagle feather that his father had given him before. His first battle as a young warrior. The feather was old and worn, its edges softened by decades of handling, but it still carried the spiritual power of the great bird that had given its life to create it. "This has protected me through every battle I've ever fought," he said, fastening it carefully to a leather cord around her neck. It connects you to all the warriors who came before, Apache, Mexican and white, all those who fought for justice and the protection of their families. Running Bear added his own blessing, painting traditional war symbols on her face with clay mixed with blessed water from their hidden spring. The symbols were simple but powerful. A mountain for strength, a lightning bolt for swift striking, and a circle for the endless cycle of life that connected all things. As the sun reached its zenith and the canyon walls blazed with reflected heat, their small war party made final preparations for a battle that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone Hale had victimized. The evidence of his crimes was secure, their strategy was sound, and their cause was just. But it was the moment when Bonnie looked into Aidam's eyes and saw not protectiveness, but respect, the acknowledgement that she had become a warrior in her own right, that marked her final transformation from the waiting child she had once been into the young woman she was meant to become. "Ready?" he asked, checking the loads in his rifle one final time. "Ready," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The battle for justice was about to begin, and Vincent Hale was about to discover that the helpless orphan he thought he could control had grown into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. A young woman with the survival skills of the desert, the fighting spirit of the Apache, and the moral courage of parents who had died rather than submit to tyranny. In the distance, she could hear his men calling to each other as they tightened their siege, confident that time was on their side. They had no idea that time was about to run out for all of them, and that justice was coming with the force of a flash flood through a narrow canyon, sudden, irresistible, and utterly transformative. The first strike came at dawn, when Hale's men were changing their guard positions and their attention was focused on coffee fires and morning routines rather than watching the canyon walls above them. Bonnie moved through the shadows like her. Apache teachers had trained her, placing herself at a vantage point where she could be clearly seen from the main camp, while remaining protected by the rocks that surrounded her position. She held her parents' photograph in one hand and her birth certificate in the other, making sure both documents were visible to anyone watching through field glasses. Then she called out in a voice that carried clearly through the desert air, "Vincent Hale, I know you're down there. I have my father's evidence about Miguel Santos and all the others you murdered." The response was immediate and exactly what they had hoped for. Men scrambled for weapons, while Hale's cultured voice roared orders that echoed off the canyon walls with unmistakable fury. But it was Sheriff Cooper's response that revealed how deeply the corruption reached. "You see, she's been completely turned by these savages. No decent Christian child would consort with murderous Apache and make wild accusations against respectable businessmen." From her position, Bonnie could see Hale himself, a well-dressed man with silver hair and the kind of soft features that spoke of a life spent in comfort rather than honest labor. He stood beside an expensive buggy that looked completely out of place in the rugged canyon, gesturing angrily as he gave orders to subordinates who jumped to obey his every word. But it was the arrival of additional riders that confirmed Ramon's worst fears about the scope of Hale's operation. Nearly 20 men rode into the camp, all armed and moving with the coordinated precision of a private army rather than a legitimate posse. These weren't local deputies or concerned citizens. They were hired killers, brought in specifically to eliminate everyone who knew too much about their employer's crimes. "The girl has evidence that could hang us all," she heard Hale shouting at his men. "I don't care what it takes. Find her and bring her to me alive. But make sure none of her Apache friends survive to tell their stories." The battle began in earnest when one of Hale's men tried to climb the canyon wall to reach Bonnie's position. Aidam's rifle spoke from a concealed position 50 yards away, and the would-be climber tumbled back down the rocks to lie motionless at the bottom. The shot was perfectly placed, not to kill but to disable and send a clear message about the skill level of the defenders. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across the vertical landscape of the canyon. Hale's men had superior numbers and firepower, but they were fighting in terrain that favored defenders who knew every ledge, every crevice, and every ricochet angle. Each time they tried to advance, they found themselves pinned down by precisely placed shots from positions that seemed impossible to assault. But it was Running Bear who provided the tactical masterstroke that turned their desperate stand into something approaching a fair fight. Using smoke signals that were invisible to white eyes, but clearly readable to any Apache within 50 miles, he sent out calls for assistance that reached reservation Indians who had their own grievances against men like Hale. "What is he doing?" Bonnie asked as she watched the thin column of smoke rising from Running Bear's carefully tended signal fire. "Calling our brothers," Aidam replied grimly. "Apache, who have suffered under men like Hale, who have seen their families murdered and their lands stolen. They will come." The psychological effect on Hale's men was immediate and devastating. These were hard men, accustomed to intimidating farmers and shopkeepers, but the prospect of facing Apache warriors in their own territory was something else entirely. Bonnie could see them looking nervously at the canyon walls, jumping at shadows, and arguing among themselves about whether the money was worth the risk. But Vincent Hale himself seemed to grow more determined as the situation deteriorated. Through her field glasses, Bonnie watched him pace back and forth beside his buggy, his expensive clothes now dusty and disheveled, his carefully groomed appearance showing the strain of a man watching his empire crumble. $20,000. "To the man who brings me that girl alive," his voice echoed through the canyon, "and 10,000 for proof that the Apache is dead." The bounty was enormous, more money than most of these men would see in a lifetime of honest work. But it also revealed something crucial about Hale's desperation. He was throwing around that kind of money because he knew that losing control of Bonnie's mineral rights would cost him millions. From her new position on a high ledge, Bonnie could see the full scope of the battlefield. Hale's forces controlled the canyon floor and both main exits, but they were essentially trapped in a killing ground with enemies holding the high ground on all sides. Every movement they made was observed and potentially targeted, while their opponents remained invisible among the rocks and shadows. The turning point came when Sheriff Cooper, apparently deciding that his corrupt alliance with Hale wasn't worth dying for, attempted to negotiate a surrender. "Miss Fletcher," he called out, his voice showing strain that hadn't been there that morning. "I'm willing to discuss terms. Nobody else has to get hurt here." But it was Hale's response that sealed his fate and revealed the true depths of his criminality. Bonnie watched in horror as he drew his pistol and shot Sheriff Cooper in the back, the lawman falling face first into the dust without even a chance to cry out. "The only terms," Hale screamed at the canyon walls, "are complete surrender. That girl belongs to me, and I'll kill every Apache in this territory before I let her." "Slip away!" The murder of Cooper, corrupt as he had been, marked a point of no return. Even Hale's own men looked shocked by the casual brutality of killing a white lawman, and several began backing away from their employer with expressions of growing alarm. But for Bonnie, witnessing that murder crystallized everything she had been fighting for. This was the man who had killed her parents, who had terrorized innocent families, and who would continue destroying lives until someone stopped him, permanently. The evidence she carried wasn't just about legal justice anymore. It was about preventing future atrocities. "Aidam," she called softly, knowing he would hear her despite the chaos below. "I'm done hiding. It's time to end this." His response. He came immediately, filled with fierce pride and warrior's approval. "Then let's finish what your parents started." The arrival of Apache reinforcements changed the entire dynamic of the battle, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of a savage assault, Running Bear's signal had summoned something far more sophisticated, a council of war chiefs who understood that this confrontation had implications far beyond the fate of one adopted white girl. From her elevated position, Bonnie watched as nearly 30 Apache warriors materialized from the desert like spirits taking physical form. They moved with the fluid precision of men who had been fighting in this terrain for generations, surrounding Hale's forces in a wide circle that left no possibility of escape while maintaining perfect discipline and restraint. But it was their leader who truly impressed her. An elderly war chief whose presence commanded immediate respect from every Apache in the canyon, including Aidam and Running Bear. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected the survival of entire tribes. "Vincent Hale," the war chief called out in English that was accented but perfectly clear, "you stand accused of crimes against Apache people and white people alike. Surrender now, and you will receive the justice of courts and laws. Continue fighting, and you will receive the justice of the desert." Hale's response revealed the depth of his arrogance and racism. "I don't negotiate with savages. You have no authority over white men, and no court in this territory will take the word of murdering redskins." The insult hung in the desert air like the smell of gunpowder, and Bonnie could feel the tension among the Apache warriors as they fought the urge to respond with immediate violence. But their discipline held, and it was the war chief's calm reply that demonstrated the strategic brilliance of their approach. "We are not here as Apache," he said clearly. "We are here as citizens of this territory, demanding that federal authorities investigate crimes committed against all people, red and white alike. Your murder of Sheriff Cooper was witnessed by 30 men who will testify in any court you choose." The psychological impact was devastating. Hale's remaining men suddenly realized they weren't facing a savage war party, but something far more dangerous. Organized resistance with legal backing and credible witnesses. Several more of his hired guns began laying down their weapons and backing away from their employer. But Hale himself had reached a point of desperation that made rational thought impossible. Bonnie watched in growing alarm as he grabbed one of his few remaining loyal men and began giving orders that sounded like the plans of a madman. "Burn them out!" she heard him screaming. "Set fires in the brush around the canyon floor. If I can't have the girl, nobody can." The threat to start a wildfire that could kill everyone in the canyon, including his own men, marked the final break between Hale and any pretense of civilization. Even his most loyal supporters began abandoning him as they realized their employer was willing to commit mass murder rather than accept defeat. It was then that Bonnie made the decision that would end the standoff once and for all. Rising from her concealed position, she walked calmly down the canyon wall, using a path that put her in clear view of everyone below. The eagle feather Aidam had given her fluttered in the desert breeze, and the war paint Running Bear had applied caught the sunlight like ceremonial decorations. "Vincent Hale," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent canyon. "I am Bonita Martinez, daughter of Roberto Martinez and heir to the mineral rights you've been stealing. I am also Bonnie Fletcher, daughter of the people you murdered to hide your crimes. And I am the adopted daughter of Aidam of the Apache, who taught me that some things are worth fighting for." She held up the legal documents that proved his guilt, making sure every man in the canyon could see them clearly. "These papers will destroy you in any honest court, but you're not going to live to see a courtroom." Hale's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling around him. Drawing his pistol, he began advancing toward Bonnie with murder in his eyes. "You little half-breed bitch," he snarled. "I should have killed you years ago along with those meddling parents of yours." But he had forgotten that he was now surrounded by some of the finest warriors in the Southwest, and his threat against their adopted sister triggered a response that was both swift and decisive. Aidam's rifle spoke first, the bullet taking Hale in the shoulder and spinning him around. Before he could recover, Running Bear's tomahawk flew through the air with deadly accuracy, striking the pistol from his hand and leaving him disarmed and helpless. The war chief's voice cut through the silence that followed. "Vincent Hale, you are now a prisoner of the Apache Nation and the territory of Arizona. You will be held for trial on charges of murder, theft, and conspiracy. Your crimes against our peoples end here." As federal marshals who had been summoned by Ramon's messages finally arrived at the canyon entrance, Bonnie felt the weight of 4 years of struggle and loss finally lifting from her shoulders. Justice had come at last, not through revenge or violence, but through courage, unity, and the determination to see truth prevail over power. The battle was over, but more importantly, the war against corruption and brutality had been won. 6 months had passed since Vincent Hale's trial ended, with his conviction on multiple charges of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The courtroom in Santa Fe had been packed with victims and witnesses, and Bonnie's testimony, delivered in a clear, strong voice that carried her father's determination and her Apache training's dignity, had been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Now, as autumn painted the desert in familiar shades of gold and crimson, Bonnie stood in the doorway of the new home she and Aidam had built together on land that legally belonged to her, but felt like it belonged to both of them. The house was modest but solid, constructed in a style that blended Anglo building techniques with Apache wisdom about desert living. Large windows faced east to catch the morning sun, and a covered porch provided shade during the heat of the day. But it was the school that had become the true center of their new life. Built with funds from Bonnie's mineral rights, which had indeed proven to be worth a substantial fortune, the Cedar Wash Community School served children from both the town and the surrounding Apache settlements. The building itself was a symbol of the bridges she had hoped to build between the two worlds that had shaped her. Inside the single large classroom, Apache children learned to read and write in English, while white children learned desert survival skills and traditional beadwork. The walls displayed student artwork that mixed cultural symbols with cheerful abandon. Eagles soaring over saguaro cacti, Apache blessing symbols alongside Christian crosses, and maps of the territory marked with both English place names and their original Apache designations. Mrs. Dorothy Crane, who had become an unexpected ally and friend, served as the school's official administrator, while Bonnie handled most of the actual teaching. The elderly woman's initial prejudices had gradually dissolved as she watched Apache families prove themselves to be as devoted to their children's education as any white parents. "That young man is going to be trouble if he doesn't learn to control his temper," Mrs. Crane said, nodding toward 10-year-old Billy Walsh, who was currently engaged in a heated argument with an Apache boy about the proper way to track rabbits. "He's just passionate about learning," Bonnie replied with a smile. "Besides, Running Bear says arguments about hunting techniques are how young warriors test their knowledge against each other. It's perfectly normal." Running Bear himself had become the school's informal elder in residence, teaching traditional skills to any child who wanted to learn them, while serving as a cultural interpreter for parents who weren't sure about the mixing of educational approaches. His weathered face still rarely showed approval, but Bonnie had learned to read the subtle signs of his satisfaction with how the children were developing. "The young ones learn faster when they learn together," he had told her just that morning. "Apache wisdom and white knowledge, both are tools for survival in the world they will inherit." The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the road, where she could see Aidam returning from his monthly trip to town for supplies. But he wasn't alone. A second rider accompanied him, someone whose silhouette looked familiar even from a distance. As they drew closer, Bonnie's heart leaped with recognition. Ramon Gutierrez had returned, looking healthier and more prosperous than when she had last seen him. The months since Hale's trial had been good to him. His work in exposing the criminal network had earned him a position with the territorial government, and his testimony had helped convict several other corrupt officials. "Bonita," he said, using the name from her birth certificate as he dismounted and embraced her warmly. "You look like a proper schoolmarm. Very respectable. Don't let the dress fool you," she replied with a laugh. "I can still outshoot most men in the territory thanks to Aidam's training." "Speaking of which," Ramon said, his expression growing more serious, "I have news that might interest both of you. The territorial governor is organizing a commission to investigate other cases similar to Hale's operation. They want experienced investigators who understand both the legal system and the local cultures involved." He looked meaningfully at Aidam, who had been listening quietly while tending to his horse. "They're particularly interested in hiring men who have the respect of Apache leaders and the trust of white settlements. The pay is good, and the work would help ensure that what happened to your parents never happens to other families." Aidam considered this carefully before responding. It would mean traveling extensively, being away from home for weeks at a time. It would also mean making sure other children don't go through what Bonnie experienced, Ramon pointed out. "And the territory needs people who can serve as bridges between different communities." That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Bonnie and Aidam discussed the opportunity that Ramon's visit had presented. The decision, they both knew, would affect not just their own future but the future of the school and the community they were building. "What do you think?" Aidam asked, his voice carrying the same respect for her judgment that had marked their relationship since she had proven herself during the confrontation with Hale. Bonnie was quiet for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, she spoke with the wisdom of someone who had learned that difficult choices often led to the most meaningful outcomes. "I think," she said slowly, "that we've learned something important about family. It's not just about the people who live in your house. It's about the people whose lives you touch, whose future you help shape, whose children you help protect." She gestured toward the school, where tomorrow she would again teach children from. "Two cultures to understand and respect each other. We've built something good here. But if we can help build similar things in other places, help other families avoid the kind of pain and loss that shaped both of us, then maybe that's what we're meant to do." Aidam smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something approaching youthful joy. "Then we'll do it together. We'll be a family that travels, that builds bridges wherever they're needed, that fights for justice in all the places where it's threatened." As the desert night settled around them, Bonnie felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she had found her place in the world. Not as someone waiting for life to happen to her, but as someone actively creating the life she wanted to live. She was no longer the frightened child who had waited on trading post steps, but she carried the memory of that child's pain as motivation to ensure other children never had to endure such abandonment. The photograph of James and Mary Fletcher still held a place of honor in their home, next to a painted portrait that a traveling artist had created showing Bonnie and Aidam together, father and daughter by choice, family by love, partners in the ongoing work of healing a wounded world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve justice and build understanding between peoples who had been taught to fear each other. But tonight, under the vast canopy of desert stars, they were simply home, a word that had nothing to do with buildings or locations and everything to do with the people who choose to love and protect each other against all odds. The little girl, who had once waited for parents who would never return, had grown into a woman who would never let another child wait alone.